In the next group of videos, we're going to be looking at cluster analysis. So let's just talk about what we mean by cluster analysis. So cluster analysis is different from classification models. Classification models, we have a label. We know in our previous videos if someone was from the south location or not south. We know if they purchase or don't purchase an item. So there we had a binary classification. We also had classifications that said this is a shirt, this is a pair of pants, this is a shoe, right? It's already labeled data. So that is what is called supervised machine learning. Cluster analysis is a form of unsupervised machine learning. We don't already have the labels attached to them. And so then cluster analysis is going to be looking for those cohorts, trying to identify those cohorts. So cluster analysis can be part more of exploratory exploration in terms of our research design, as opposed to more of that descriptive data research design. And so then when we do our cluster analysis, here we're looking at cluster analysis as part of our predictive analytics. And so we're putting it in the class of predictive analytics because we're trying to predict the behavior of certain individuals or the outcomes of certain events by others that have similar characteristics. So we're trying to identify their related cohort, related people or behaviors that might help to explain their behaviors. We don't already have the labels for the groups, so we're looking for commonality that would help define the group, and then likely we have to give that group a name. There are different types of cluster analysis. We're going to look at k-means clustering. We're going to look at hierarchical models that are also called agglomerative clustering. And we're going to look at a clustering analysis method called DB-scan. So we're going to focus on those. There are other methods, so you can explore this further. So let's start with the k-means clustering. So if we have our data set here at the top, we don't know these data points. We don't know their labels. We don't know what groups these data points belong to. When you do k-means clustering, the data points are assigned to a group, so the data point is closest to the center of the group. So when we're looking at, okay, so if these are going to be a group, then, and this is going to be a group, then we look at, is this point closer to the center of this or the center of that? Now, when you do k-means clustering, you're going to have to decide how many clusters we're looking for. So you could specify there are 2 clusters, blue and green. Then here it's going to find a center for blue and a center for green and assign so that the points that are identified as the blue or green groups are going to be ones that are closest to the center of that group. So we have to then define how many clusters. If we were to define that there are 3 clusters, green, purple, and blue, we can then look at each data point is going to be closest to the center of the cluster in which it's assigned to. When it comes to k-means, because we're looking at this issue of distance here, then we need to have interval or ratio data. It does not work with nominal or ordinal data. So we have to have interval or ratio data. So we're going to look here at our customer relationship management database that we've been pulling information from. And here we can look at, for example, the company revenue. How much does the company make? And we could look at the projected value of the contract. Recall that our company does web design. And so then if we look at the relationship here between the company revenue and the projected value of any product we do for them, can we identify groups of companies? So maybe this is one group, here's another group. And so we can start to investigate what these groups, individuals or events in these groups have in common. And then perhaps we can target our marketing to those groups differently. We could price differently for those different groups by identifying that they have something in common. When it comes to assessing our cluster analysis, we can't use the methods we used in the classification model. We can't use accuracy because we don't have labels, so we can't actually check if we've correctly identified the cohort. And so we can't then use precision or recall. So the tools that we had available to us to assess our classification model, we don't have available to us here. So we have to use some alternative methods to compare different approaches to our cluster analysis. So with the k-means clustering, we have to choose the number of clusters. So one way to choose the number of clusters is to use what is called the elbow method. The elbow method looks at how far data points are from the rest of the cluster. So we talked about how k-means tries to put each data point closest to the center of the cluster. Otherwise, it's putting it to another cluster. And the elbow method looks at how far the data points are from the rest of the data points in the cluster. So they should be a little denser, right? And so then the number of clusters just past the elbow point in this elbow method, so here's our elbow, okay, just past this where it starts to straighten out, that's going to be the optimal number of clusters. Because what this tells us is that if we added another cluster, if we went from 4 to 5, it really doesn't add any additional return. It doesn't add any extra value to us. Okay, so we'll look at the elbow method. We'll look at something called the silhouette coefficient. The silhouette coefficient looks at how far data points are from other clusters. So while the elbow method looked at how far data points were from other data points within the cluster, the silhouette coefficient looks at how far data points are away from the other cluster. When we look at a silhouette score, if the silhouette score is close to 0, then there are no meaningful clusters. We really can't find any groups here in our data. The closer the score is to 1 for any particular variable here, the more the clusters are, or sorry, for this group here. So this is a particular group, a cluster, here we go. Then what we see is that the closer it is to 1, the more this cluster is different from all the other clusters. And we could see that here, right? This particular group here, much more in terms of company revenue. It's very distinct from the other clusters. So you can see that its silhouette coefficient here is close to 1. If the cluster score is closer to -1, then it means that the data points are in the wrong cluster. It's been put into the wrong cluster, and so we have issues here in terms of our algorithm. If we look at the silhouette coefficient for this particular data set here, we can set a benchmark of 0.8 for the silhouette score. And so this indicates really there's 3 clear-cut clusters. And then what you can't see that my face is hiding is that there are the remainder of these the data set that's right here, where it's quite dispersed. There's a lot of variability in this particular group. And so we're not quite sure if this should be its own cluster. And so you can see it doesn't quite meet the threshold. So right here, there's at least 3 clusters, maybe this 4th one that's kind of the catch-all for all the others. So we have the elbow method, the silhouette coefficient, and you can see in this particular, the second example, if we're looking at additional clusters, maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe we want to be even more specific and break this group down into 3. You can see that is 1, 5, and 4 in the label here. 1 doesn't quite meet the benchmark. 5 just crosses it. 4 just crosses it. So perhaps if we're not going to go the route of this 4 here, where this is a catch-all for the remainder, we could go and break them even further and try to separate them out into further clusters. There are 2 other ways to assess our cluster analysis. And so as we go through these different methods, we are going to be comparing our different number of clusters and our choices here. So the other 2 to look at are the Calinksi Harabasz Index. And with that one, a higher score indicates that the clusters are well separated from each other. So we're looking for a higher score. However, the downside to this method is that it tends to favor models with more clusters. And so it really does err on the side of telling you more clusters than some of the other methods would indicate. And then our last one we're going to look at is the Davis Bouldin Index here, where it, unlike the others, a lower number is the better fitting model. So in our next video, what we're going to do is we're going to do some k-means clustering, and we're going to take a look at these different ways to assess how many clusters we should have and how well our algorithm is working, even though we don't have any labels.